Okay, so what we're going to do in this lecture, lecture number 4, is we're going to look at notions of efficiency, we're going to look at taxes, and we're going to look at price controls. Another way that we could kind of think of this chapter as what it's doing is it's looking basically at what happens either when the market is not used, when you have government intervention. So that would be things like price controls. That means setting the price something other than the equilibrium price, or you have taxation. And then our notions of efficiency, we're going to be talking about why the market is so great, right? So I've got a whiteboard. This is pretty exciting here, huh? Right, in chapter 3, right, we had our simple supply and demand curve, right? And in this notion here, right, we had a equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And we kind of left the discussion right there. What we're going to be doing here is talking about why this is so great, why this equilibrium price and quantity is the most efficient, the way of understanding that. And then in this other parts of this chapter, then we're going to talk about what happens when the price is set artificially higher, and what happens when the price is set artificially lower. Okay, so the first thing that we want to understand then are notions of efficiency. And we can understand that efficiency by looking at things known as the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. And what we're going to say here is that when a market equilibrium is reached, in other words, we have the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity, that we're going to have two things that are maximized. Those two things that are going to be maximized are the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So the consumer surplus, and again, I know you've got the notes here. Hopefully, though, this is a good supplement to those notes and to the textbook as a whole. The consumer surplus is going to be the difference between, I'm just writing this out here, it's going to be the difference between the maximum price that you're willing to pay, something that we would also know as the reservation price. So the reservation price is your maximum price that you're willing to pay. The consumer surplus is going to be the difference between that reservation price, the maximum price that you're willing to pay, and the equilibrium price, which will actually be the price that is actually paid if you have a free market. And if we draw that out here, right, we've got our supply and demand curve here. Then, right, this would be our equilibrium. This demand curve contains a finitely large number of reservation prices. So the consumer surplus is going to be, let's say at the first quantity, quantity 1, is going to be the difference between the maximum price that they were willing to pay, which is represented by the demand curve, and the price that they actually paid. And then so on, and so on, and so on. All the way until this entire region is the consumer surplus. Now, how could we alternatively calculate that? Well, the one thing we could then do is we could use the area of a triangle equation, right, which would be 1/2 base times height. If we're looking at that, right, then what we would need to do is we're going to need 3 pieces of information. We're going to need to know the equilibrium quantity. That'll be the height of this triangle, or depending on which perspective you have, it could also be the base, I suppose. You're going to need to know the equilibrium price, and you're going to need to know this price as well. Now the question would be, how would you get the y-intercept of the demand curve, this price right here? You could do that by substituting in 0 for the quantity into the demand curve. So for instance, if I gave you a demand curve which was 100 minus 2p, right? Let's say that that was your demand curve. Then what you could do is say it's 0 equals 100 minus 2p. 2p equals 100. P equals 50, right? And so now I would know that that price up here is 50. So we would then just take the area of that triangle, 1/2 base times height. That would give us the consumer surplus. Now, if we want to look now at the other component here of what's going on, that would be the producer surplus. So in the case of the producer surplus, what we have here, just writing this out again, we have the difference between, from the firm's perspective here, the difference between the price received for selling the good, which if this is a free market, that would be the equilibrium price. So there's a difference between the price received and the minimum price they would have been willing to accept. So in our